So I think you heard an audio. I'm so sorry about the confusion. I thought this kind of problem might happen because we have so many time zones in the program. And so I think that makes it, Ortwin, thank you. Okay. Your microphone is off, Ortwin.
Yeah, well, let me first apologize for being late. I thought it was 3:30 and maybe I just misread the program, and that's why I was a little late now, but I'm glad that I could shorten my previous engagement, and I'm very happy now to give my keynote if you are all ready.
Yes, we're very ready. Thank you so much. Okay.
Okay, then I'll start. Okay.
Okay, well, yeah, I thought I already introduced you, so.
Okay, good. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you also for the invitation to give this keynote address. I'm very honored to be here and also to discuss my points with you after I finished my keynote. It will be around 45 minutes so that we have enough time also to have a good discussion afterwards. The topics that I have selected was how the perspective on systemic risk and risk can help us or has helped us to cope with the COVID-19 crisis. And I will certainly also rely partially on the experiences that we made in Germany, but also in other countries. And I would like to structure my talk in 3 different parts. The first part is that I would like first to start out with why is the risk perspective so important in this event? And to say a little bit about the risk perspective and why it has such a great, powerful, I would say a great, powerful influence on understanding complex situations. And secondly, I would then draw your attention to the issue of complex and specifically systemic risks, and that expands the risk perspective, which of course is extremely important for understanding the COVID crisis, and to go into the properties of systemic risk and how they manifested themselves in the COVID crisis situation. And the third part would be that I would like to draw some conclusions on those 2 parts on what we learn in terms of risk governance and how to improve risk governance specifically with respect to the COVID-19 crisis. So let me start with number 1, why is the risk perspective so instrumental for understanding complex risk situations such as pandemics? And anything that is complex has a very strong problem, and that is we never are able to understand the full complexity, and we're always obliged to simplify. And that is the major problem. Do we simplify to the right degree, or do we simplify in a way that actually the complex nature is not being really addressed? And the risk perspective has a very interesting and I think very powerful tool, and that is that we only have 2 major elements to think about. The one element is the risk agent, and the other element is the risk absorbing system. And these 2 elements sometimes also called the risk cause, but I think it's not the cause, it's really the agent. And the other one is also sometimes called the target. Now, what does that mean? It means that basically we are talking about a whole set of different causes that can be all kinds of natural, social, cultural, technological events, or also a human behavior that leads to something that is triggered. And that something that is triggered will be absorbed by someone else. And that could be a person, could be society, it could be an ecosystem, it could be a financial asset. And that agent has the potential to cause harm on the target that we would like to protect. And that's a very simple picture. But the very simple picture, as I said, very powerful because it tells us something about the sequence. We have a cause of something, that cause releases an agent, that agent meets something that could be harmed or violated by that agent. And then it depends on the vulnerability or resilience of that agent, how it copes with this situation. And then we have the consequences out of this. And so these middle parts, the agents and the risk absorbing system is basically the core aspect of any risk analysis and of the risk thinking. And then we have another interesting simplification, which also provides a very powerful tool. Normally, when we talk about risk agents, we have basically 6 agents that we are dealing with. The first agent is energy. So anytime we have a natural hazard event, we have a release of energy normally. It could be fire, it could be explosion, it could be a big flood that has kinetic energy. So energy is something, it's one of those agents that can harm others. Secondly, it could be substances, so all kinds of chemicals or pollution, all kinds of things that have a detrimental impact either on our health or on our environment. Thirdly, it's biota. So these are bacteria, those are mushrooms, those are viruses. Of course, COVID-19 would fall into that category very clearly. And that can have a harm on our society. The fourth one is information. Now we get to the more social part of it. Information kills. And that's a real important aspect. It's one thing if you have the wrong information, for example, on COVID-19, and we have seen that unfortunately even on very high political circles, that wrong information was given out and that has actually killed people. So information is a very powerful agent, and it's a one that, of course, in a society which is based on communication, because we don't have direct access very often to the phenomena that we study, only through secondary sources. We can see it through science or through media. Information is extremely important. So that's number 4. Number 5 is money. It's also a very powerful agent. Just think about the stock market. And number 6 is violence. And the interesting thing is, as hard as we think, there are not more than 6, or they can be somehow combined into these 6. And so what we can see is we can really locate any risk within that. We can say which of the 6 risk agent is involved and what is the risk absorbing system, what was the cause for the risk agent to be delivered, to be released, and what are the consequences of the risk absorbing system that is exposed to this specific hazard, to the specific agent. Now, the complex system comes now into play that these 6 different agents are all interconnected. And that, I think, makes the risk analysis perspective so powerful. You know, all our ministries, all our risk reduction agencies are normally dealing with one of those 6. So we have agencies that deal with natural hazards, basically with energy release. We have others that deal specifically with issues like chemical substances, pollution. We have a third one that looks into health and infections. And we have a fourth one that looks into financial risks. And, but what we can see in a complex world is that all these 6 drivers have a strong interconnection with each other. And we have seen that so clearly in the COVID-19 crisis. It was a biota crisis. So biota were released. These biota have the possibility to kill people. Now we know it's around 0.6 to 0.8% of all the ones that have been affected were actually killed by the virus. That's 3 or 4 times more than a normal flu. So in that sense, it's very clear that it was more powerful, but that's only a part of the story. I mean, the other story is that through all our lockdown measures, we have stifled partially the economy. We have seen social isolation. There's a lot of other problematic impacts. We can see that wrong information has killed people or made people miserable. We see that we have a loss of money in terms of the economy or a shift of money. And definitely in some areas, we've even seen violence popping out and or at least relationship to violence between the crisis and people's responses and reactions to it. And I think the really important aspect of us as being, risk analysts in this field is to say, look at those interconnections. These interconnections are really important. And if you want to have balanced policies that are driven by good trade-off making, by good judgment, it's very important to see, well, if we reduce, for example, the possibility of exposure, which we have done quite successfully, but increase the negative impact of information or the increase of violence or the increase of money losses, well, we need to make a good trade-off between those. And the risk analysis gives us good tools for doing that. for balancing both sides, for saying, well, what is on one side of the scale and what's on the other side of the scale? And unfortunately, not only two sides, there are 6 sides on the scale. So we have a 6-scaled weighing system here. And so we need a multi-attribute or multi-criteria decision-making system that can help us to make prudent trade-offs in the light of these multiple hazards that appear at the same time. So this is my first very important message that I would like to convey, that given this kind of risk perspective, it on one hand makes things quite simple because we're looking at what is the agent, which agents interact, what are the interactive effects of all these agents, and what do they have an impact on our risk absorbing system. And that again could be multiple. It can be human health, it can be societal well-being, it can be economic prosperity, it can be ecosystems. So we have very different targets in the end. And again, they interact, but it's not arbitrary. So we have only, maybe 5 or 6 in an instance that we have to look at. And so we have a number of causal models that we need to interact, or that we need to look at the same time, that give us a fairly complete picture, even of a fairly complex structure. And that is, I think, is an important element, because nobody can deal with 2,000 variables at the same time. I know that large models can do this, but then nobody understands how they work. I think simplifying it to an effect that we can deal with, let's say, 12 or 15 variables at the same time, at least conceptually, and then we can, of course, have substructures below that, but specifically for the integration from science into policymaking is very, very important. And I've experienced that myself, and talking to policymakers in Germany, when I came up and said, so we have these 6 agents, we need to look at these 6 as they interact. That was easy to communicate. If somebody else came and said, I have a model here with 1,200 variables, and now we're trying to make a cluster analysis over all those 1,200, well, everybody was lost in a very short period of time. Now, that does not mean that all these very complex models are not of any use, but I think conceptually it's very important that we have something that is as powerful as risk analysis. There's a lot of experience that we have over the last 4 or 5 decades that show that we have, coped with many other crises, having this kind of instrument available. And again, I would stress that in this COVID-19 crisis, a good risk analytic perspective was extremely helpful to understand the basic parameters and also their interaction. So that's the end of my first part, just to point out again what the power of risk analysis is and how it can help us to focus on the most important elements. Now, coming to the second part, is we talked about...
Professor Ortwin, yes, I'm sorry for interruption. Yes, are you planning to have some PowerPoint slides to share, or
No.
you do not need it? Okay, I'm sorry.
I thought I would not do that because, this is, trying to put this all in words. I think it's a better way to do that. And I can send you the PowerPoint later on, but, for presentation, I think it's much better to just have the oral presentation.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. Okay, sorry for that.
You're welcome. So I come to my second point, and that's a point of systemic risks. And we normally distinguish between conventional and systemic risks. And there are kind of 4 to 5 properties of systemic risks that distinguish them from just normal conventional risks. And in itself, COVID-19 is more a conventional risk. I mean, we have been dealing with viruses all history along, and the causal model there is fairly simple. There's a virus, and if it gets into our system, it can create havoc with our health. But everything around that, of course, is much complex. And as you can see before, if we extend our agents from just the biota to all the other things that I mentioned, and then it becomes a very complex web of interactions. And then we are in the realm of systemic risk analysis. And there are a couple of very important properties to look at. The first very important property is, and that is almost self-telling when we talk about the interaction of the various agents, that all these systemic risks are transsectoral or even transboundary. And boundaries not only meant national boundaries, but also boundaries between jurisdictions, boundaries between different types of hazards, interboundaries, or cross-secting different ministries, different agencies in terms of political agencies, different authorities that are responsible or accountable for them. And so all these systemic risks have the common property that they defy a silo in which they can be treated. That's a very important element, because in most of our risk management institutions, we have risk institutions that are divided according to the cause of risks. So we have natural hazards or chemical explosions or pollution and health and so on. And they're all different bureaucracies, different agencies that deal with that. With systemic risk, again, they're all interconnected. And so it's sometimes very problematic if they're handled by just one agency that would probably minimize the risk of one agent and then maximize the risk of another agent. So for example, the COVID-19 crisis, we could have minimized the risk of exposure and then had a collapse of the whole economy, which of course nobody would like to have. So in that sense, making these trade-offs means we need to have transboundary and transsectoral balancing acts, and that we can really transgress the institutional structures that we deal with. The second major property that we need to think of is that these systemic risks, more than a normal risk, are stochastic by nature. It means that we cannot tell who is affected and when he is affected. We can only say out of a large population, so many will be affected within that period of time. And that, of course, has a lot of implications specifically for risk communication. We know very well that if you have something like a normal distribution curve, where you say, okay, there is extremes on the right and the left, but they're asymptotic going up to zero, that we have people, if they need to change their behavior, so if we ask them to change their behavior, for example, to do social distancing, they believe they're on the left side of the Gaussian normal distribution curve, and that means it won't happen to me. No, this is something, I'm always the one that keeps healthy and I have a very good condition, and it's not me who will be affected. And then if people want others to change, so those that see others not wearing masks or others that, don't keep the distance, they believe they're on the right-hand side of the Gaussian normal distribution, and they think, well, if something happens, it will happen to me. And so they're the most sensitive people in the world in their self-perception. And that, of course, creates a lot of aggression and a lot of conflict, because in a sense, even if they rely on the same data, I mean, the normal distribution curve both sides will say, yes, that's the one. But if I locate myself on the left-hand side, very far left or very far right on this, I'm either extremely vulnerable or I'm extremely resilient in my own point of view. And that has created a lot of problems in the civic communication about COVID-19, because we've seen that people reacted very differently. We had quite a few people that were extremely anxious, that went home, didn't even go shopping, so had problems of dehydration, problems of malnutrition, so other kind of risk, another agent, substance in this case. And they had to be encouraged, it's not as bad as you think, you can go out, if it's wear a mask, it's fine, and so on. And you had, on the other hand, people that said, oh, I am, invulnerable, nothing happens ever to me, and, when I go partying and do all kinds of things. And so that sense is the stochastic nature. I mean, it's very difficult to understand for ordinary people, because they feel, they locate themselves somewhere, and then they're very determined about this. And then it's difficult to communicate with them and also to get compliance with the common policy. So that's the second point that I would like to raise, is the stochastic nature of these types of risks and its impact on policies and communication. The third point that's also already said is that these risks are very often highly interconnected with other risks. So is that they combine different risk agents, and that's more with systemic risk than with any other risk. And that means that if you deal with one type of risk You have to deal at the same time with different types of risk. And if you take the 6 agents again that I mentioned at the beginning, you can see the interaction between those 6. Not all of them are always involved, but 3 or 4 are always involved. And it's like juggling with several balls at the same time, which is kind of difficult. It's also difficult because people and policymakers very often focus just on one outcome and forget all the others because it's getting too complicated for them. And that's what we see very often, that one risk is minimized on the expense of another. And the 4th point is, and that's not so strongly in the case in the COVID-19 crisis, but very often we have tipping points. And tipping points are a very treacherous phenomenon, because for a long period of time, you believe everything is fine, and then you surpass the tipping point, the threshold, and then everything collapses. And we've seen this very often in ecological crisis. We can probably see it in climate crisis, where that happens very often, that nothing happens for a long period of time. And if then a specific threshold is exceeded, the whole system collapses. And we've seen also in the financial system, more or less. And that's so difficult to deal with also from the policy side, because basically people learn by trial and error. And so if you do something and nothing bad happens, you continue doing it. And that's true for individuals as well as for whole societies. And so, in the climate change, we can see it in many other areas in which, people just continue doing it. And in spite of the warnings of scientists and others, they say, well, it doesn't happen. I mean, we put all our, let's say, pollution into a lake, and the fish like it, and they seem to be happy about it. And, we can bath in it. And then after a specific threshold is over, you have over eutrophication, and then the whole lake dies. And then, of course, everybody is saying, oh, well, we didn't want that. And but then it's too late. And so it's also a very important policy message here. If we have these kind of thresholds, if we have these kind of tipping points, to be aware of them. And again, it's very difficult for policymakers because they have to introduce unpopular measures before some negative things pop up. And then the people say, well, why should I do all these negative things for me for something that I even don't see coming? And on the other hand, if the threshold is exceeded, the politicians will be blamed for not having warned everyone. So it's not a good game to win. And then, of course, for the people themselves, again, we have then together with the issue of stochasticity, so the stochastic distribution, that people again say, well, I'm on the safe side or I'm on the more sensitive side, but as long as nothing happens, nothing will happen. And that's a very important element, is the tipping point. So we have these 4 major elements. So the first one is transboundary, transsectoral. Secondly, stochastic. Thirdly, highly interconnected. And fourthly, very often with tipping points, nonlinear dose-response relationships. Now, again, we can see that that has an impact on our discussion about COVID-19. Let me start with the first one, and that's the issue of transgressional nature. We have seen in almost all countries of the world that the first people to ask for advice were the virologists and the epidemiologists, and I think that was absolutely necessary, and there's no criticism of any kind of this. However, many countries fail then to see that we have other risks popping up, and that the risks are interconnected. And now we need to include also economists, we need to include behavioral scientists, we need to include risk analysts to say what other risks are we, inadvertently causing that needs our attention. And we've seen in some countries that some of these secondary risks had a much higher impact than actually the first risk in terms, for example, of life loss. And so that's a very important element here, that those management systems that were aware that we have multiple risks to deal with at the same time have done much better than those who have not done that. The second point, stochasticity, I think that's the second point. We've seen that we have a lot of countries in which this element of stochastic nature of the risk has led to a polarization within the population. Some who ignore the risk and don't believe it's real, even, sometimes even enriched by all kinds of conspiracy theories, QAnon and others, you all may be aware of them. And the other side, as I said, that are overprotective and thinking they're all half dead before they're even infected. And then communication is very, very crucial. And we have seen that sometimes countries have been very good in doing this communication, trying to have a differentiated communication for all these different polarized groups. Others have more or less failed in this. The third thing in terms of the interconnectivity, I think that's very close with number one, intersectoral. I think many people were quite surprised to see how things are interconnected. I know that I had been involved in some discussions on social distancing and its impact, and we said, well, you know, if you have a family with, you know, several kids in a very small apartment, and the male, well, normally the male person is already fairly aggressive in the first place, and we're going to have a real a problem with home violence. You know, I was laughed at and said, well, that's the least thing we are worried about. And now it turns out, even in Germany and other countries even more so, that this is a substantive risk. It's not, you know, a few cases. So that's a point that we need to make sure that these kind of interconnected risks are really being addressed. And then the last thing, the tipping point thing, I think that was not so strong in the pandemic, because from the beginning we had you know, people that were affected, and then you could see that the numbers was going up. Again, we have delay effects, so that, you know, and a lot of people were not aware that, you know, the number of fatalities, of course, lags behind the number of new incidences. And now we have to interpret the numbers in the right way, that there are time lags and others. But the problem is that in terms of the tipping points were not as strong as maybe with other major threats that are in front of us, specifically things like ecological crisis and climate change. So this, again, would lead me to my last part of my lecture, and that is the issue of what do we learn for governance, for risk governance. And I think when I would combine it a little bit with risk governance and risk communication, I think both are very important to address. And they are very, you know, interconnected, as you all know. So my first point is that I think the failure of many countries to address this issue, not only as a public health issue, but also as a public risk issue, has had an impact on their performance in the overall crisis. I can, you know, don't want to hand out any numbers, and again, the number of N is of course small, but it seems very clear that if you only deal with it as a health crisis, you may have really underscored or underestimated the other types of risks, and that can have some very detrimental effects. So I think all those countries that have from the beginning on said we need to balance these type of risks have done better, have fared better. And in terms of governance, it's very important that the various agencies and ministries work together, have maybe even an emergency staff that comes together in these very peculiar circumstances and try to understand how each of them is affected by the crisis. And then to say, what can we do in order to at least reduce the risk to the various constituencies to which we are responsible. And so I think the major aspects that I think we need in advance of a crisis have something like an emergency board, national and maybe even regional, and also even on the municipal level, to make sure that we are prepared for something, and that is interdisciplinary and intersectoral, so that it's not just one crisis that we think about, but also of the interconnectedness of crisis. Very related to this point is that we can see that, yes, it's very important to be consistent and coherent, but it has to relate to the specific regional situation. And I know that Norio, who's made the introduction that I unfortunately missed, is very keen on that issue. That is very clear that these kinds of risks are not evenly spread all over the world, as it seemed from the news. We have hotspots, we have areas which are hardly affected at all, and we have areas in which we have, some risk or some higher risk. And it's very important to be proportional to the various risk level, and that means governance should have a very clear combination of national, regional, and local responsibilities. And of course, we need to have national coherence, but within the fluctuations in the various countries, in the various counties, in the various communities, we need to have the flexibility to act more or less severe depending on the situation. And that also is very clear from this intersectoral perspective, because any risk reduction on the health side increases the risk of something else. And that, I think, something we need always to balance, and then regional, sometimes even local level is extremely important. So that's my first major lesson. It's work together, cooperative with different ministries, and work cooperatively with all vertical governance levels, but make sure that we have a decentralized system in which we can act flexibly on the degree and intensity of the hazard present. My second point is with the stochastic nature, and again, it relates to this. Risk governance, specifically in a crisis, is 60 to 70% risk communication. And maybe even more in that case. I mean, this was very clear now with the social distancing. This is something you have to communicate. I mean, then if you do this poorly, people will not follow. We had some confusion about wearing masks. I mean, in East Asia and Southeast Asia, masks were already popular, so there was not a big deal to get people to wear them. United States, until now, it's a real problem. In Europe, it was a problem because in the beginning, the politicians said no, some of the scientists said no, others said yes, so there was confusion. And so the communication was not clear, was not unambiguous, and in that sense, it created a lot of confusion and irritation. And if you want to make sure that behavior is, in a sense, compliant with what you like people to do, you have to have a communication that's convincing, that's clear, and that's consistent. That doesn't mean you don't have to be flexible. I mean, you should be flexible in relation to the degree of hazard present locally, but it should be consistent with some overall goals, for example, some overall yardstick when to intervene. So stochastic nature makes first sure that communication is extremely important, and secondly, that it's not just one communication that will be convincing for everyone. In good risk governance for these kind of risks, you have to think about those people that are locating themselves on the left-hand side, also locate them in the middle, which is the easiest, and locate them on the right-hand side, and to make sure that the pointed message gets to them. And we have tried, for example, for the very left side who thinks they're invulnerable and thinks that nobody can hurt them and that they are in very good health condition and young and whatever, that we told them, yes, you're not under attack. So fine, if you feel you're invulnerable, feel that way, but you might be a carrier for somebody else. So please, be also careful and attentive to the needs of others. And that was something that I think sold quite well, because the people didn't want to be, the messenger of or the conveyor of disease to others. And on the right-hand side, we basically try to also develop neighborhood groups that would help others that were just too intimidated to go out of the house. And so I think we need to make sure we address these different people on the different sides of the stochastic Gaussian normal function. The third thing, as I said, is the non-linearity, which, third thing was interconnectedness. That is also something that is extremely important, because what we need to make sure in the risk governance is to make sure that the various needs and risks are being interconnected, and that we can see that reducing one type of risk increases another. Very often that's not even clear, even for experts, and that's where what we call inclusive risk governance is so powerful. That, as I said before, I mean, trying to do an inclusive approach in the middle of the crisis, of course, is not really something you can do, and it's not recommendable. because you need to do it swiftly and fast. But you can set up everything so that kind of committees are in place, like in South Korea, we had such committees in place, to help the risk managers to see what other type of risks are affected and who is really being in a very bad situation. And given the example of social violence in small homes, or we had, some real problems in terms of economic performance in the cultural scene. And I think it would have been much better also in Germany if we had some of these committees in which representatives of these groups were there, or people who know about them, like social workers. And then I think it would be much easier to say about, which kind of childcare needs to be definitely offered in what areas. And then to say areas in which people are very low income and have, very crowded apartments, that's where we need to have childcare in place, even if there is a little higher infection rate. So these kinds of trade-offs are very important and really show if a government is able to address all these issues at the same time, and their inclusive governance is a very important element. And inclusive governance means having those committees ready so that if the crisis strikes, we can take their concerns and their experiences, and they have a lot of experiences, for providing better management and more prudent management plans. And the last point, I think, was the tipping point. I said that's not so crucial in this point, but the more general aspect is in addition to having, a wide scope of risk management agencies working together, so integration, as I said before, in addition to have transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary knowledge included, it's also important to develop something like a learning culture. And a learning culture is a culture in which we monitor the situation. That's extremely important for complex risk situations, because we not anticipate everything that's going to happen. We anticipate something, but not everything. And then be flexible in terms of an adaptive management style to say, oh, something pops up here that we haven't addressed it, and we need to include it. And that kind of learning style, together with a very good monitoring system that goes and monitors the environment, the social, the natural, the cultural environment, and to feed back signals to say, oh, well, we have a problem here which we haven't anticipated, and we need to address that. That's extremely important for being a good governor and having a very good governance system. So let me conclude my keynote at this point. First thing is, what I would really like to convey is, of all those who are working in the risk field and also in the hazard field, and most of you are, the perspectives that we have as risk analysts is one that is really important for the COVID-19 crisis, but for any other crisis to come. And I think the COVID crisis has made and demonstrated very clearly how important this perspective is, because it provides very simple tools, but they're extremely powerful even for very complex situations. My second message is that we have to deal with specific systemic features and properties that are difficult to handle in governance and communication. One is transboundary, transgressive, it's a transministerial, trans-silo. So we need to get this integration coming, and that's easily said, difficult to make. And second property, as I said, is the issue of stochasticity, all stochastic relationships. That's difficult to manage in the first place, but is also very difficult in terms of risk communication. The third thing was the issue of this interconnectivity of different risk frames and different risk agents. And again, intersectoral, interdisciplinary cooperation is very important there. And lastly, we need a learning adaptive management system that helps us to deal with surprises that will come up and some of the complex consequences that are impossible or very difficult to anticipate. So my final word is, well, we are risk analysts, we care, and we can show we care, well, we also can do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ortwin, for your wonderful very deep message, carrying speech. Thank you very, very much. And I'm very sure there are lots of questions to be raised. Maybe we'll have about 10 minutes for discussion. It seems Gisela Wachinger, you are there. You have some comments or questions to Ortwin. Gisela? Yes.
Thank you very much, Ortwin, and hello.
Hi, Sarah.
All the things were very important for us for risk communication, but one point you mentioned the effect. Sorry, I have to look it up. This tipping point effect, that this is mostly in ecological risks or in climate change risks, but I think there is a very important point at the moment, the discussion coming up about the percolation effect. Maybe could also be a problem in the COVID-19 crisis, and what can we do there if this is really an effect which leads to a tipping point where the infection rates cannot be influenced by measures anymore. So what can we do then, and what can we communicate?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Gisela. I think that's a very important point. I mean, when I said tipping point, I mean, normally what we mean is nothing happens until the tipping point is reached. Now with COVID-19, we have a little different situations, as we know that things happening, and right now we see also the numbers go up. But there's certainly a threshold, or at least I would say a corridor of thresholds where things can turn to become ugly. And one of these major thresholds is the capacity of the healthcare system. And we have seen that very clearly, I mean, Germany, for whatever reasons, and that I think very, grateful to our politicians, they had prepared a fairly, health system that was much more resilient than many other countries. And so even when we had the first big wave, we were able to treat all the people properly. And that has really contributed a lot to the very low numbers of fatalities in Germany. Other countries were much worse off, partially because they didn't invest in resilience, and partially because the first wave was even stronger than what we have experienced in Germany. So yes, there are these kind of thresholds, and then they can turn a quantity into a new quality. And I think that very glad that you pointed this out. I think it's not so obvious in this crisis, but it's certainly something that we need to take into account. And just like we have conventions in the climate change, we say 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, knowing that 2.1 degrees wouldn't make much of a difference. With 2 point, I mean, it's not, at 2 point something, the world explodes. Again, something like COVID-19, if we say more than 50 people per 10,000, that's our threshold where we start to have, again, more protective measures. Is a convention, but is the way to trying to find a threshold below the actual tipping point. So I'm very glad that you raised
that. May I ask a question, Norio?
Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you so much. This is Mohsen Ashtiani.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your excellent talk. And actually, you touched on this science and policy, which I had a talk, on that same, around the same thing. I think you touched on very important points, that usually the governments, they have so many sectors, and these sectors, they don't talk together, or they are in different, even different specialities, different area. I think what we need to do in this, and you touched a very good point about a systematic approach. We should have a nexus approach to bring all the players together to have a common interest, with the common interest that it is the saving human lives, protecting the resources. I think that sometimes the organizational arrangements and the policies distract us from our main objectives. And the policymaker, usually they become that their organization become the priority, not what is they want they have to do. Therefore, they, in order to protect their integrity of their organization, or the survival of the organization, they only go single direction, or they're making cross-section of solving the problems. I think we need to solve integrated, bring everything together. And I think this, the objective of our society, IDRiM, that is the whole thing. We want to have an integrated risk management. And I think even though this is very trivial and we think it should be done, but they're not being done. Each country you go, you have the same problem, integration. Look at how they treat the COVID in Iran, in the US, in Europe. I think one of the issue is lack of integration. One group said, the business should operational. One group says we should have a safety. We cannot bring all together in order to decide, what is the total benefit? What's the overall benefit?
Yeah.
We should not only think of education, or not only think of business, or not only think of health. We should have integrated approach. And I think that is really, this COVID situation shows that how important is to look at the systematic risks. As you have said, there's so many factors contributing, we cannot just say one of them. And again, I appreciate your excellent talk.
Yeah, well, many, many thanks, Michelle. Thank you that you are also with us again. That's great. And I could not agree more. I mean, I've, just give you one example. I was at one of the meetings, and then, one of the agencies that were directly affected said, well, this is a place to tell us we have not enough personnel. We need more people. And I could say, well, not again. I mean, we're in the middle of the crisis. And then the first thing they were saying, we want to strengthen our organization, just exactly what you said. And it's difficult to do. I mean, and it's not so that we have very good role models for this. I mean, that's something we may think also in IDRiM about it. What are good models? I mean, I have proposed things like a risk council with 2 chambers, one a political and one a scientific chamber. And again, the Chancellery has said, oh, maybe that's a good idea, but nobody really picked it up. So how can we make it true? I mean, we need ministries. I mean, we cannot have a ministry for everything, but we need this kind of horizontal level of cooperation. And that's something where I think all the countries in the world, regardless what kind of governance structure they have a deficit, that the cooperation between on the level of integration is extremely difficult to reach. And there's so much organizational self-momentum that keeps people from cooperating. And I've been many meetings where people said, well, I know the other guy is right, but it would hurt my ministry, so I won't support it.
Exactly.
Thank you, Ortwin. Yeah, and I also agree with Amos, and this is a very important point. Are there any questions?
Bill.
No, there is a comment from the chat also from Bill Simbieda.
Simbieda, okay. Bill, please.
Well, my comment, I was thinking about how does this model address systemic risk, address compound hazards or cascading hazard events, where things are linked and other things happen that, yes.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you very much for this comment. I think it highlights again, when I talked about the risk agents, I think we can really model well with those risk agent cascading effects. And we have done this, for example, on floods. So we have a flood, which is energy. The energy has reached some of the chemical companies. They were broken. There are substances out of it. These substances led to a poisoning of people, but the poisoning of people also went to the place that they didn't drink water. So we had dehydration. At the same time, water was not in a pure situation, so they got infections. The infection led to people that they were really unhappy, and so they went out to protest, and even violently. And the industry lost all the money. So we can see is we can use the 6 agents to do the cascading. And the cascading can be from one energy level to the second energy, the third energy level, but it can also cross over from one agent to the other. And that's really interesting to watch and to see. And I think in terms of risk management governance is that we have to think about, when we see any of these risks happening, let's say a natural hazard event, how does it affect all the other agents? And then again, we're coming back, to what Moshe and others have said. Now we need to make sure that the people that manage all the other risks are coming on the same table and say, look, we have now a natural hazard, but it's going to be a chemical pollution issue very soon. And now you have to act because, you are the ones responsible for chemical pollution. And this kind of cascading effect, I think it's very, very important. And it's a good example of how these 6 agents interact.
Can this be applied? I mean, this is the way you presented it is a very sophisticated model that assumes that the ministries are highly specialized and highly educated and staffed. This is certainly the Japanese model in the ministries, for sure, and some of the other Asian ministries. But in countries where you have fragile or weak, systems of government support, how do you get this flexibility built in when, in the absence of strong ministries, what you get is unitary policy? I just don't know. I mean, it's from what you said, it's great in Japan or Germany, but I think in other countries in the world, it won't work. Or it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely your opinion. I mean, it's, ideal is one thing, but it's good to have an ideal picture. I mean, though, no way to strive for. And you can see that countries, as you said, Japan, Germany, Korea, many others have done very well also in the crisis and have shown that it works and that you can save lives. I mean, very unfortunately, some other countries where I had believed it would work well, like the United States and partially UK and Brazil, it's different. But we can also see there, I mean, and I don't want to be in any way political here, but, if you have a political leadership that is only interested in themselves rather than in the benefit of the people, then you can see the results. I mean, and you see policies matter. I think that's what we can see very, very well. I mean, a lot of people have said it doesn't care. I mean, all these agencies work automatically and policies have no real impact. No, it's not true. We've seen policies have an impact. And that is, for me at least, a very strong encouragement also to think about where we have fragile governments, where we have failed governance structures. Is there a substitution that can work there? And I think, when I said about this kind of risk commission, I think that's an interesting model. I've seen that South Africa has done something very similar. And other countries, even on some of the more countries of the global south, in which, people from different ministries who have that kind of capability, plus, experienced people from, for example, NGOs and health organizations, some even, international ones, if they have a committee together in which they can, advise at least the policymakers on how to make prudent decisions, I think that could already help. I mean, it's not ideal, but it does help. And I think even the experiences that some of these countries have made with these kind of committees or boards at least give rise to some optimism. But in general, it's very clear there's an ideal, and we have to see if the institutional setting in a way that we can deliver it, and if not, what can we do to have the best substitute for it?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, maybe I could just, take one more question or comment. All right.
Norio,
Okay,
may I make a little question?
Okay, please, Hiro.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ortwin, it's a really wonderful presentation. I have also had I'm very happy to understand, but one thing I cannot reach the conclusion, that is governance and responsibility. In the such a kind of systemic risk situation, complex risk situations, actually, who can take responsibility over our consequences? In what way we can say establish such a kind of governance systems? I don't understand in what way we can lead to that point.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Hirokazu. That I think is a very important issue, and I may have not addressed it as much as I should have. The issue is when you talk about decentralization, it doesn't mean diffusion of responsibility. And I think a lot of literature on high reliability organizations have shown the worst thing you can do is to put responsibility on millions of shoulders and nobody is responsible in the end. And then, of course, that's an invitation to disaster. However, I think it's very important that when we think about different situations, that we are adaptive to the consequences in these different situations. And I know that Norio, I think he can also comment on this because he has done wonderful experiments with smaller communities and regions in Japan to give them more responsibility. But given the responsibility means also giving them the accountability. So they're also accountable for what they're doing, not just responsible. And then, of course, in a system of layered responsibilities, the federal government is, of course, accountable for giving the guidelines for everyone. And then that these guidelines are being then, further conditioned to the situation is a responsibility of someone further down the line, but that person further down the line or institution is also accountable. And if that person fails or is doing all the wrong things, then of course he or she would need to be replaced. So in that sense, what I would definitely say it's important is not to diffuse responsibility or accountability, allocate it very clearly. But I think for complex risks, it doesn't help to have, let's say, the risk czar. I mean, there have been, interesting enough, for a long period of time, there was this issue of risk czars. The risk czar that comes up and says, I know all the things and I tell you what to do and I am accountable in the end. That's not working. I mean, it's working for a very linear risk, fine. But if you have a complex risk, it's not working. Nobody in the world can have all this complex knowledge. So we need to have nested systems of responsibility. However, it's very clear that is not an invitation to diffuse responsibility.
Thank you very much. A very interesting idea for nested responsibility. I want to learn more about that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I think it's getting very late here in Japan.
Yes.
And let's say before I conclude, well, I've been doing a lot of, community-based approach, and this has much to do with what, Ortwin was talking about, sort of adaptive governance on a small scale, and but we also need some common ground. The common ground that can cut off different disciplines or sectors. And here's the question of how we can create or initiate, foment this kind of common ground. Common ground comes first, or some people there, and then common ground will grow. This is a complicated issue. But I'm very much convinced of the importance of fomenting some creative and communicative common ground. And I believe that this kind of, academic community itself, which started in a very small scale, growing and growing a lot. And this is also kind of, growing our common ground. Ortwin, I don't need to answer, but sort of another point I can see about this COVID pandemic. It will have a sort of long-lasting influence, and there may be some big time lag, or for instance, many years later, we'll see some work style will immediately change. So it will be a kind of tipping point that would come out later, but not immediately. And this kind of long-lasting effect would also be part of this COVID-19 triggered dynamics. What do you think about it, Ortwin?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nori. I think that's a very crucial question. I mean, and I know that you have been working so diligently and of course also so successfully on that interaction between the various levels of governance. I mean, on the community level, on the regional level, and then on the national level, and that this kind of attentive management that you have been propagating for many, many years is based on that kind of interaction, that there is a clear responsibility on the local level, given the situation and given the local circumstances. And I think that's an important aspect, that's the local aspect. The other one is the timely aspect. And the timely aspect is, of course, another important element. And we can see it specifically, of course, when we talk about climate change or other ecological issues, that even if you would do everything what's ecologically good, it would take decades before we really see the results. And that's difficult for people that are used to learn by trial and error. And let me make that point again. I mean, with COVID, at least we could see whether measures were helpful or not with a delay of maybe 2 or 3 weeks. And even that was already hard for many people to take. Now, if you think about a hazard that where protective measures will only really be effective 2 or 3 decades after you've taken all these measures, how can you make that politically feasible? And I think that will be an extremely difficult challenge. And I think what we've really experienced with COVID-19 is even simple compared to that. And we need to have very good policies in place, as you've said, very good policies in place to bridge that time gap between the measures that may have some negative impacts on economy or life being because it takes away some of the wealth from people. And the effects will not be seen until maybe years later.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we should close this session by giving big hand to Ortwin. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you all for your attention. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
So goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ortwin, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention for this session. We would like just to remind you that we will be resuming, according to the schedule, we will be resuming with the program at in about 3 hours from now. So you can check your local times to see that. Please refer to the schedule. And
2 a.m. in Japan. That's
2 a.m. in Japan, but I wanted to avoid saying that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
See you later,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.